I said something a couple of years ago, which just now has started to make people very angry. And in this video, we're going to look at whether I was right or wrong by following some of the critics' advice and looking at, well, how do we do textures? What is the best way to do our textures? Now, one thing that we all agree on is that textures are not just interesting, but they're vital in art, even in black and white. The textures of these different surfaces all around us tells our brain exactly what they are. And textures, even on the most mundane of objects, can actually make it interesting or maybe even beautiful in a certain kind of light. What I'm referring to is a short, which you can see linked in the description below, which has gone, if not viral, then certainly blown up. Probably because people are finding it a bit controversial, and that is the YouTube algorithm for you. Now, what I said in that video was that drawing textures quickly, leaving a little bit of detail out, was better than drawing them really tightly and trying to draw, for example, every single brick. But I fully accept that I overstepped the mark. That is my opinion, and it is not necessarily better. And in this video, we're going to explore exactly where I'm right, or I think I'm right, but more importantly, we're going to look at where I am wrong. We're going to follow some of the advice in the comments below that, and we'll see where that gets us. The first thing to consider before we jump back to the studio and start practicing our textures is, what is texture? In art, I think textures are two things. So firstly, if we look at this wall behind me, we can see it has texture. What do we mean by that? We mean that it has a very tactile quality. If we feel it, it will be rough, it will be bumpy. And texture is the physical property of the material that we're trying to reproduce on our page. And therefore it is also in art, the reproduction, how we literally make that physical feeling, that physical sense, that physical texture appear realistic or reproduced onto our page. Texture in art also is the texture of our media itself. For example, have you ever tried to reproduce watercolor-like textures with oil paints? What I say to that is good luck. Each different media, even the paper we're using, imparts a definite texture, definite sense of feel into our art. And that texture is just as important as the reality of the world that is around us. There's more questions to ask as well, because it's not just about reproducing the world. Our art is also about ourselves enjoying it. It's about our style, and it's about the story that we are trying to tell. So even though texture has a big part in our interpretation of the world, does that mean that the best art would be the most realistic, the most accurate reproduction of all these different fences, for example? Would that make the most interesting version of this scene? This might feel like a lot to cover, but I have a great couple of exercises which we can do together, where we can explore and consider the textures that are out there and the textures that are in our palette, and see where our happy place lies. Because I said at the beginning, am I right or am I wrong? Well, I imagine that the answer is somewhere in the middle. So we're back in the studio, and it's time to start exploring different ways of doing textures and seeing the advantages, the disadvantages, the ways in which they work, and the ways in which each of these different techniques has challenges. And let's work out the best way of creating textures if we can. The first thing I'd like to do is create a big house. So I would suggest you join in with me. Draw on a A4 or letter-sized piece of paper a big, wide house. It needs to be wide enough that we can do 3 different textures, or perhaps more if you want, on it. And we're going to do 3 separate sort of ideas here. One of the key things is we need a little bit of, let's call it wall furniture, things like the windows and the doors, a little bit of surroundings to our house, because it's all well and good saying, oh, this is the quickest, the best way of doing textures. But we need to be able to work it around other things which are going to be on our walls, like the windows. So, draw our house and let's get started. Technique number 1 I'm going to do on the left of my house, and this is from a comment. They said, what you must always do is draw horizontal lines and then connect them with vertical lines. That's the quickest way to accurately do bricks, essentially. So let's start by doing that. And what I'm going to try and do is keep those horizontal lines not too heavy. And this is the problem here that I find with ink heavy techniques, is you do have to be very delicate. You can see as we build up, it is feeling a little bit stripy, but then as we start connecting those vertical lines, it does come together quite nicely. It is ink heavy for sure, and that might, in a moment when we add some colour, have some ramifications, but for now this is a pretty good way of demonstrating a certain type of brick. We need to remember this is a certain type of brick. This brick is a modern red brick, isn't it? It's nothing else. You could change the proportions and make it perhaps sandstone, but sandstone walls tend to be a little more uneven and have different sizes. The other thing is, was it easy to draw around all the windows? It really actually was. And, it's easy to just pull across those horizontal lines, get them going through or past the windows. So this is a nice and flexible technique for one type of brick. It also didn't take super long. And this is something we'll come back to later, but the speed of sketching is something many of us want to consider. So this wasn't as long as I thought it might be, but it's certainly not as quick as the next technique. And the next technique is, let's call it my version. So my version is really limited amount of ink, just a few lines, and suggesting the textures more than anything else. Now here I'm a little bit slapdash, so we end up with a different type of brick feel. But this isn't something which has the same sort of limitation. This could be anything. And there are loads of amazing artists who use this kind of limited suggestion of brick to create amazing textures. For example, Ken Young Line and Wash. So Ken Young is an amazing artist. I've mentioned him on this channel before. And just looking through his Instagram, you can see how he uses this style of ink work, and you're in no doubt about the texture. And another artist, Simon Blackbird, who occasionally says hello on the lives we do here. I've got his Instagram link down below as well. What you'll find with some of Simon's work is he does use little suggestions of texture, and that is more than enough to let you know exactly what is going on in the scene. I also am in no doubt that this is really fun for me to do, and it's really, really quick, which is an important part of considering what we're going to actually complete and how much fun we're going to have versus the sort of stress of producing an image perfectly. Now, number 3 is the drawing every brick mode. And this is the one with the most flexibility. It's also the most time consuming. Literally drawing every single brick, trying to keep them in line takes a lot of concentration. Trying to keep them the same size takes a lot of concentration. It's a great way of drawing different textured bricks. So instead of having a strict modern wall, we have a crumbly wall, we have a big church or something like that. What this lets you do is really impart some artistic license and feel into your scene. But it also hurts my hand. So doing it like this takes a very long time. And if we are being realistic about the idea of sketching outside or doing 3 or 4 sketches in an hour, this way is not your answer. Although it's amazing, it takes an amazingly long length of time. And even if I did it more, I'm never going to get that much quicker, because a lot of the method of this is taking that time to gently pour over it. An interesting thing to note with each of these is the amount of touch-up work that we need to do next. So with the 2 ink-heavy sketches on the left and the right, we end up with a more illustrative feel. And the reason is, because there's lots and lots of ink there, the big structural lines of our building need to come forward. So we need to make a lot of lines more bold, which necessarily makes things feel more illustrative. In the middle, we're left with a lot of decisions we can make. We still have the structure of the building, we can make it illustrative, we can leave it flexible, we can do more at the end or more now. There's a lot more variation that we could go in from this point onwards. And that's before we start adding the colours. So again, on the left and the right, it's watercolours. We're going to start with a loose wash. In the middle, of course, there's my version, which is make it abstract and experiment and explore the colours themselves. And then those ink lines give us brilliant places to control a little bit of tonal variety, a little bit of textural variety as well with our colours to produce different types of brick. And this is where we're starting to recognise that actually, you know what, these different techniques aren't better or worse, they're just different and they're producing rather different effects. We can see this enhanced more and more as we add the colours. And with all that said and done, I have my finished tripartite sketch here, and which is my favourite. Well, I asked Tash because it's best to have an impartial witness, and her favourite was this one. And I'm not surprised at all, because that's the style that she likes the most. My favourite to look at is probably, to be honest, it is actually still this one. I really like that abstract feel. I like that loose feel. My favourite that I wish I wanted to do more would be this one. I get quite a bit of joy out of the sort of gentle building up of lots of textures and details. But doing a full house like that, I'm never going to concentrate. So I need to sort of balance beauty versus practicality. But we'll come to that later. The third thing we're doing, we'll be looking at how we can build these textures into this style of art. But it gets even more complicated because this scene is very specific. It's got no perspective. The house is big. It's filling our page, and the page itself is quite big. What if the bricks are really irregular? What if the house is a long way away? What if we have lots of houses to do, or they're really small in our scene? All of these things will impact how we actually find it most effective and most practical to produce textures. So grab another sheet of paper and let's try something out. First, draw a little scene. I've got a church and a couple of trees. I'm going to draw it twice, and this time it's a long way away. And now let's try drawing textures. So on the left, we'll do a minimalist and suggestive version of the textures. We might need to embolden some areas, again, maybe making it a little bit more illustrative with a clear outline. But for me, these suggestive textures make it relatively clear what this church is. On the right, we'll have our grid. And for me, this becomes a bit too ink heavy. So this grid method suddenly looks very linely, very bold. And for this particular use case, it's not as effective as it was for that first example. And this fits with reality. If we're really close to something, we can suddenly see a lot of details about the textures. And if we're much further away, suddenly those textures become softer. We only see some of those bolder lines and those boldest, biggest bricks, for example. Of course, if we are up close, what we might notice is lots of the bricks are different sizes and very irregular, which means that grid method still isn't going to work. But we can draw every brick. And in this instance, what I'll say is this is a really effective way of doing it, which produces a wonderful study of that texture. Again, even just drawing this simple tower is rather time consuming. And this is a problem for me. It might not be for you, but it is certainly a consideration for everyone. The effect is wonderful, but how you are going to use this to sketch, when we call sketching something which is normally quite a quick process, is an area of balance, let's say. It may not necessarily fit into sketching, and it may turn into a multi-day project, or certainly a several-hour project. On the other hand, we can produce a looser, more abstract version. Again, my version is always going to be even more loose and silly than many other people's, but I showed you earlier the versions from Simon and Ken, which produce really realistic textures just with a bit of suggestion. The theme here, though, is becoming obvious, and it's that idea of balance, because what if we don't draw every single brick in a scene? What if we are selective? Instead of being really loose and abstract, like some of my examples, and instead of being really sort of time-consuming and slow, like some of my other examples, we could approach a scene where we draw every brick in an area and leave other parts of the scene a little bit more to the imagination. This may be that middle ground that we've been mentioning all the way along. By doing this, we draw the eye to the key textures, the most important bits, but we don't suddenly feel drawn to that need to draw every brick and overcrowd our image, which is kind of what I was trying to say in my short those years ago, but admittedly didn't do a very good job of explaining exactly what I meant. Perhaps the best illustration of this is if we come back to our house. Now, did you prefer this texture, this one, or this one? Because if you think any one of these is good, and you weren't off-put by this rather loose expression of the roof, where I've just suggested the tiles, then clearly you're not bothered by a loose expression of texture. It's just that you want somewhere to have your textures a little bit more refined, which is fair enough. With all of these things, watercolours can make a huge difference, and the amount of ink and the type of texture you apply with your ink is going to impact the decisions you make with your watercolours. From semi-realistic to incredibly loose and abstract, you have loads of options, and it's this interaction which can often make a boring ink sketch seem amazing, or even an amazing ink sketch suddenly become tired and dull because there's just too much going on. So the last thing that I want to have a look at is just blending these textures. There's no reason why you can't both be specific and abstract, both in one part of the scene and in another part of the same scene. What I want to do is go back to our first house. I'll draw it a little bit differently this time, but I'm using heavily textured paper. This paper makes my lines necessarily a bit loose and wobbly. I challenge you, even with the best ruler in the world, to draw a straight line on heavyweight rag paper. Within that, we're already exploring our media. Our media is becoming part of the art. On top of that, I'll draw lots of little bricks. But instead of filling the whole house with them, I'll do enough that I feel content. And then on the other parts, I'll be more abstract, just using horizontal lines and simple hatching to show that there is something going on. But again, making this more about the process of creation rather than a photorealistic or illustrative version of the scene even. On top of all of this goes some loose and abstract colours on one hand, and in a few of the bricks, some specific touches to show exactly the kind of texture we're after. Again, these colours are now exploring the idea of watercolour as part of the texture. The textures produced by this paper, produced by the watercolours, are in no way realistic, but we accept them as part of the art because we've specifically chosen these medium. And with that, we have left with my favourite sketch of the day. So here I have blended several approaches. It is not realistic, but little segments perhaps will satisfy those people who would like more detail, and little segments satisfy my inner demon who wants everything to be incredibly loose. Let me know what you think. Leave me a comment. Am I still being too controversial? Or is there something else I should have explored today? Join me on Sketch Loose, free course linked in the comments below, and subscribe, like. I will see you in one of these videos next. So thank you everyone for watching my little sketching videos. If you enjoy my content, please do subscribe to my channel because it makes me really happy. Thanks again.